For phones, policies, and permanent record threats, schools in the 1960s ran on bells, chalk dust, and grown-up authority. Kids lined up for the pledge, learned by hand on paper, and got discipline from people, not software. It was stricter in some ways and looser in others, with rules about skirt hems and hair length, but freedom to bike to school, trade lunch snacks, and invent games at recess. This video will take you through 30 moments that defined school life in that decade, from the Pledge of Allegiance to graduation day. 1. The Metal Bell Morning. In the 1960s, a school day didn't begin with a buzzing alarm on your nightstand or the vibration of a phone in your pocket. It started with the sharp clang of a metal bell that echoed across the playground and down the long tiled halls. That sound was both a call to order and a reminder that the day's routine was already set in stone. Kids lined up outside the building, sometimes shivering in the early chill, sometimes swatting at the summer heat, waiting for a teacher to wave them in. The walk through the doors was the first signal that playtime was over and discipline had begun. Morning meant homeroom. Attendance was called out loud, one name at a time, with every student expected to answer clearly. It was more than a roll call. It was the first checkpoint of the day, proof that you were where you needed to be. Afterward came the Pledge of Allegiance, hand pressed to chest, eyes fixed on a flag usually hung in the corner of the classroom. Nobody questioned it. The ritual was so ingrained that even kids who didn't quite understand its meaning recited the words automatically. For those who walked or biked to school, mornings carried their own rhythm. Shoes scuffed the sidewalks. Schwinn bicycles leaned against fences. Friends met halfway down the block and moved in groups, lunchboxes swinging. The schoolyard filled with chatter before the bell, but once it rang, conversation stopped. Teachers stood like sentries at the doors, scanning lines, making sure shirts were tucked in and hair looked neat. There was no gentle start. The morning bell was a command, and students adjusted their posture, pulled straight faces, and filed inside. Lessons would stretch ahead in long blocks, with only short pauses in between. But the tone of discipline and order began the second that bell rang. In today's terms, it was the reset button for the entire community. Everyone knew their place, their role, and their responsibility. For better or worse, that clang marked the real beginning of the day, and it still echoes in the memory of anyone who went to school during that decade. 2. Rows, chalk, and public mistakes. Step inside a classroom in the 1960s, and the first thing you'd notice is the rows. Desks were arranged in long, perfect lines, all facing forward like soldiers on parade. Each was heavy, often carved with initials or doodles left behind by students from years before. These desks didn't swivel or roll. They were fixed in place, meant to keep everyone facing the blackboard, where the real action took place. At the front, the blackboard stretched across the wall, its surface coated in a fine layer of chalk dust. Teachers kept a box of chalk within reach and an eraser that left their hands gray after a few swipes. When they wrote, every word seemed permanent, even though it could be wiped away in seconds. Notes, math problems, spelling drills, and history dates were all laid out in big, looping letters for the entire class to copy down. The smell of chalk lingered, mixing with the wax of the polished floor. Learning in that setting felt public. If a teacher asked a question and you answered incorrectly, everyone heard it. There was no hiding behind a screen or whispering to a neighbor for help. Mistakes happened under bright fluorescent lights, and the silence that followed could feel endless. On the other hand, getting an answer right earned real recognition. A nod, a rare smile, or your name written on the board for good work could carry you through the day. Students relied on paper notebooks and sharpened pencils. The sound of lead scratching across a page filled the room as 30 kids worked at once. Erasers left little pink crumbs scattered across desktops. For subjects like math, errors meant starting again from scratch. No delete key to save you. Teachers demanded neat handwriting, and penmanship practice was treated as seriously as arithmetic. The classroom was a stage, and the teacher was in full control. Lessons flowed in a rhythm: explanation, demonstration, then practice. It was structured, predictable, and demanding. Some kids thrived in that order, while others counted the minutes until recess. 3. The teacher's look was the app. In a 1960s classroom, there was no smart board, no attendance software, and no behavior chart projected on the wall. Discipline and order came down to something much simpler: the teacher's presence. Every kid knew the power of the look. A raised eyebrow, a pause in the lesson, or a sharp turn of the head could shut down chatter faster than any app or alert ever could. It didn't matter if you were whispering in the back row or tapping your pencil too loudly. The moment that gaze landed on you, the message was clear. Teachers carried an authority that was rarely questioned. They didn't need technology to back them up. Their voice alone could command a room. A call of your full name in front of 30 classmates made your stomach drop. Even the way they set down a piece of chalk could send a warning. The smallest gestures carried weight, and everyone learned to read those signals. Some teachers kept discipline through quiet control. They paced slowly between desks, scanning notebooks, making sure eyes stayed on the lesson. Others were louder, using their voice to fill every corner of the room. Either way, no one doubted who was in charge. And if you tested that boundary too far, consequences came quickly. A trip to the principal's office wasn't digital paperwork. It meant facing authority in person, with a phone call home waiting for you. This wasn't always about punishment. That same presence could also encourage. When a teacher stood behind you, watching as you worked through a tough math problem, the silence felt supportive as much as it was strict. Their attention was something you wanted, even if it made you nervous. A simple, "good job" carried more weight than any sticker or grade on a screen today. The memory of those classrooms sticks not because of fancy tools, but because of human authority. Teachers managed 30 restless kids with nothing more than tone, body language, and expectations. It worked because the rules were clear, and the respect, or sometimes the fear, was immediate. Long before apps tracked behavior, it was one pair of eyes that kept the entire room in line. 4. Corporal punishment was on the table for students in the 1960s. Discipline could sting, literally. Many schools saw physical punishment as an ordinary part of maintaining order. A wooden paddle, a yardstick, or even a teacher's hand across the knuckles wasn't viewed as shocking at the time. Parents often backed it up too, believing that a little pain built character and kept children from worse behavior down the line. It wasn't hidden behind closed doors. Everyone knew it was a possibility, and the threat alone shaped how kids behaved in class. The rules that could bring punishment were sometimes small. Talking back, chewing gum, being late, or even failing to sit still might bring a sharp reminder. Some teachers tapped knuckles with a ruler. Others used a paddle stored in plain sight, hanging on the wall like a constant warning. Detentions and suspensions existed, but physical correction was quicker, and in the eyes of many educators, more effective. For students, the experience wasn't just about pain. It was about the embarrassment that came with it. Getting called to the front of the class meant all eyes were on you, and that public moment often hurt more than the swat itself. Whispers spread afterward, stories exaggerated, and reputations grew. For some, it sparked resentment. For others, it was a wake-up call to stay in line. The practice wasn't uniform. Some schools used it rarely, while others treated it as routine. Regional attitudes played a role, with stricter enforcement in many southern and rural districts. The cultural expectation was that kids would learn respect through fear and consequence. It was woven into the school day so deeply that few questioned whether it was fair. 5. Dress codes that measure hemlines. In the 1960s, walking into school meant stepping into a world where what you wore mattered almost as much as how you behaved. Dress codes were strict, and enforcement was not subtle. Girls faced the ruler test. If a skirt didn't reach the knee, a teacher might measure and send them home. Pants for female students were usually banned, no matter the weather. Dresses, cardigans, and neatly pressed skirts were expected, and anything else drew attention quickly. For boys, the rules focused on neatness. Shirts had to be tucked in, collars straight, and belts fastened. Haircuts stayed short, clean, and above the ears. A few brave students tried to copy the Beatles' longer hair by mid-decade, but many schools cracked down. A principal could decide whether your appearance showed discipline or defiance. Sneakers were often restricted to gym class only, while regular school days demanded slacks and polished shoes. These codes weren't just guidelines. They were enforced daily. Teachers patrolled hallways, checking for rolled-up skirts, untucked shirts, or shoes considered too casual. Some schools even held assemblies to remind students of the standards. For teenagers pushing against authority, fashion became one of the earliest battlegrounds. A new haircut or a slightly shorter hemline wasn't just a style choice. It was a small act of rebellion. Peer pressure made it even more complicated. Students who followed every rule sometimes teased those who didn't. At the same time, kids who bent the rules could become trendsetters, admired by classmates while irritating staff. The dress code shaped not only personal expression, but also social identity. Everyone knew who the sharp dressers were and who risked a lecture or a note sent home. By the end of the decade, the culture outside school was shifting fast. Tie-dye shirts, bell-bottoms, and longer hairstyles appeared on weekends, even if they were banned Monday through Friday. Schools held firm, though, clinging to the belief that tidy clothes meant tidy behavior. 6. Note passing, the original DM. In the absence of phones, texting, or instant messages, folded slips of paper carried more weight than any notification ever could. Passing notes in the 1960s classroom was an art form, and every student knew the stakes. A carefully folded triangle or square could hold a joke, a confession, or a plan for after school. Getting it from one desk to another without being caught required timing, stealth, and a little bit of luck. The content of these notes varied. Some carried quick doodles or funny one-liners meant to brighten a dull math lesson. Others were far more serious, containing secrets about a crush or whispered gossip about who liked whom. In many ways, these slips of paper were miniature diaries that didn't belong to just one person. They were meant to be read, shared, and remembered. Of course, there was always the danger of interception. Teachers developed a radar for suspicious hand movements under desks. If caught, the punishment could be embarrassing. Some teachers ripped the notes in half on the spot. Others read them out loud to the entire class, turning private thoughts into public jokes. The risk only added to the thrill. Passing a note successfully felt like outsmarting the system, a small rebellion that made the rigid order of the school day a little more exciting. The paper itself added personality. Notes were often written in colored ink or with elaborate handwriting styles. Girls decorated edges with hearts or stars. Boys sometimes drew cartoons or exaggerated sketches. Every crease, fold, and scribble gave the note character a physical reminder of a moment in time. Unlike today's disappearing messages, these could be kept in a pocket, tucked into a notebook, or saved in a shoebox at home. 7. Recess was the social network. When the bell rang for recess in the 1960s, the schoolyard became its own world. For 15 or 20 minutes, rules loosened, voices grew louder, and energy filled every corner of the playground. Kids spilled out onto blacktops, dirt patches, and grassy fields, and in those short breaks, friendships were tested, rivalries sparked, and imaginations thrived. Girls often gathered around jump ropes, chanting rhymes in rhythm as they skipped in and out. The songs were passed down year to year, familiar to everyone, yet always slightly different depending on who was leading. Boys crouched in circles, shooting marbles across dusty patches, each glass sphere a treasure to win or lose. Farther out, the brave ones claimed the swing sets, pumping their legs to see who could go the highest, daring each other to jump off mid-flight. Not every game was organized. A stick could become a bat, a rock might be home plate, and suddenly, a baseball game was underway with rules invented on the spot. Other times it was tag, hide and seek, or chasing across the yard until the whistle blew. Every corner had its code, the fence for secret talks, the steps for trading cards or sharing gossip. These spots gave the playground layers of meaning, invisible to adults, but clear to every kid. Recess was also where social life played out. A whispered joke could make you part of the group. Being picked early for a team meant you had respect. Getting left out stung in ways that stuck long after the game ended. It was loud, messy, and sometimes unfair, but it was where children learned how to negotiate, compete, and cooperate on their own terms. There were no screens or structured activities. Everything relied on imagination and quick thinking. Arguments flared, rules changed mid-game, and yet, by the time the bell rang, the energy shifted back to order. Kids lined up again, shoes dusty, faces flushed, ready, or not, for the next lesson. 8. Sandlot PE and Pickup Pride. Physical education in the 1960s didn't come with high-tech gyms, branded uniforms, or fitness apps tracking your steps. It looked a lot more like a sandlot game, rough around the edges, but full of pride. Kids ran laps in worn sneakers, stretched in rows on creaky wooden floors, and played ball games that relied more on energy than on gear. A dented softball, a beat-up basketball, or a scuffed dodgeball was usually enough to keep the class going. Many schools had open fields or asphalt courts where kids learned the basics of teamwork and competition. Rules were often bent, depending on who was in charge, and fair play could sometimes mean arguing until the loudest voice won. The whistle of the PE teacher was the only referee most of the time. Their commands carried across the field, and you moved whether you wanted to or not. For boys, the pressure often leaned toward proving strength and speed. Being fast in a sprint or hitting a ball far into the field could earn respect that lasted for weeks. Girls were usually guided toward calisthenics, relay races, or rhythm-based activities, reflecting the gender expectations of the time. Despite the split, every student knew the value of those moments when they stood out. One well-timed catch, one unexpected win, one round of applause from classmates. Not every child loved it. Some dreaded the mile run or the rope climb that seemed impossible. Others thrived, treating PE like the highlight of their day. Either way, the lessons went beyond exercise. Kids learned how to push themselves, how to lose in front of others, and how to share a victory. The pride wasn't in trophies. Most schools didn't hand those out casually. It came from recognition in the moment, a shout of your name after a great play, or the nod of a teacher who rarely gave compliments. PE in the 1960s taught kids more about grit and resourcefulness than about perfect form or long-term fitness goals. The games may have been improvised, the equipment simple, but the pride students carried out of those fields was real. It was competition in its rawest form, and for many, it became the memory of what teamwork and effort truly felt like. 9. Cafeteria rituals and snack trades lunch. In a 1960s school was more than a meal. It was a daily ritual. The clatter of trays, the smell of mashed potatoes with thick gravy, and the sound of kids rushing to find their friends made the cafeteria one of the loudest places on campus. The menu rarely changed much. Salisbury steak, fish sticks on Fridays, canned fruit, and of course, the carton of milk that was both a requirement and a challenge to open without spilling. Every table had its own rhythm, and where you sat often said more about you than your grades ever could. Not every student carried the same tray. Some brought foil-wrapped sandwiches from home, usually peanut butter and jelly or bologna on white bread, tucked into metal lunchboxes decorated with rockets, cartoon characters, or cowboys. Opening one of those boxes felt like opening a piece of home. Inside, you might find an apple, a cookie baked the night before, or even a napkin with a quick note from mom. For kids eating from the cafeteria line, the trade-off was convenience, but it came with food that was the same for everyone. Snack trading became its own form of currency. A Twinkie, or a pack of cookies, was gold, and kids learned fast how to negotiate. A handful of jelly beans might buy a slice of someone's brownie. Potato chips were powerful bargaining chips, and gum often closed a deal. Deals were whispered, made with quick glances, and sealed with a nod. Sometimes you left lunch with less food but more status, depending on how you played the game. The cafeteria was also where friendships solidified, and social groups showed themselves. Some tables erupted in laughter, others leaned in close for gossip, and a few kids sat quietly, finishing their food before heading outside. The mix of noise, smells, and personalities created an atmosphere that was unforgettable. Even the sound of the bell signaling the end of lunch felt like an interruption. Decades later, people can still remember the taste of those meals, the look of those trays, and the deals made over dessert. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it was a place where kids learned the small lessons of belonging, negotiation, and routine, all in the middle of a busy school day. 10. The transistor radio era. By the mid-1960s, music was slipping into school life in ways adults couldn't always control. The small pocket-sized transistor radio became a prized possession, and students carried them in backpacks, jacket pockets, or even hidden inside lunchboxes. For many kids, that little device felt like a direct line to freedom. One flick of the dial, and the Beatles, Elvis, or Motown stars filled your ears, even if you were supposed to be focused on homework or waiting quietly for the bus. These radios weren't just background noise. They shaped identity. The kid who always had the latest singles became the trendsetter, the one others gathered around during free time. Radios turned playground corners into makeshift fan clubs where students argued about who was better, the Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones. Sometimes a group would huddle close around one radio, volume turned low, trying not to attract the teacher's attention before class began. At dances and pep rallies, radios gave way to record players, spinning 45s that set the tone for every social event. But the transistor made music personal. You didn't need permission from the school to listen. You needed a battery and the courage to sneak it out. For many kids, it was the first time entertainment could move with them, carried right in their pocket. Teachers, of course, noticed. Some confiscated radios on site, slipping them into desk drawers until the end of the day. Others turned a blind eye, knowing full well that music was part of the culture they couldn't stop. Even in strict schools, the sound of a faint melody leaking from a pocket during study hall was a reminder that the outside world was always creeping in. What made the transistor radio so powerful wasn't just the music itself, but the sense of connection it gave. Students felt part of something bigger, whether it was Beatlemania, the Motown wave, or the folk revival. Those tiny speakers carried more than songs. They carried the feeling that youth culture was alive and changing. In the middle of rigid schedules and strict classrooms, that little burst of sound reminded kids that the world beyond school was moving fast, and they were part of it. 11. Friday night football and pep rallies. High school spirit in the 1960s had its heartbeat on Friday nights. The week built toward football games, and by the time Friday rolled around, energy buzzed through the halls. Pep rallies weren't optional entertainment. They were a ritual. Students packed the gym, banners hung from the rafters, and the marching band filled the room with drums and horns that shook the bleachers. Cheerleaders in saddle shoes or pleated skirts led chants, their voices echoing across the walls. Even kids who never cared much for sports got swept into the noise. The games themselves were more than athletics. They were community events. Parents filled the stands, younger siblings ran along the sidelines, and teachers showed up too, some grading papers between plays. Halftime brought marching formations and baton twirlers, a spectacle just as important as the score. For players, it was pressure and pride mixed together. Every yard gained felt like it carried the weight of the whole school. Social life unfolded right alongside the action. Couples huddled under blankets in the bleachers. Friends shared popcorn. And rivalries with other schools turned ordinary kids into hometown heroes for one night. The scoreboard mattered, but so did who sat with who got called down to the field for recognition, and who managed to slip away with friends after the final whistle. Not everyone fit into the football scene, yet it still touched everyone in some way. The Monday after a big game, the outcome carried into classrooms and lunch tables. A win brought bragging rights. A loss gave rivals ammunition. School dances often followed. The gym floor transformed with streamers and a record player. For shy students, those dances were as nerve-wracking as the game was thrilling, but they were part of the same tradition, tied together by Friday night. 12. Sock hops and school dances. When the gym lights dimmed and the record player clicked on, the whole mood of the school shifted. Sock hops and dances in the 1960s weren't polished affairs with DJs and light shows. They were simple, awkward, and unforgettable. Folding chairs lined the walls, crepe paper streamers drooped from basketball hoops, and the faint smell of floor wax mixed with perfume. A teacher or chaperone usually sat at the edge, arms crossed, making sure no one got too carried away. The music set the tone. Early in the decade, kids swayed to doo-wop and Elvis. By the mid-60s, the Beatles, Motown, and the Beach Boys had taken over. Records spun one after another, and every song brought a new kind of nervous energy. Fast numbers filled the floor, everyone laughing and trying their best. Moves. Slow songs changed everything. That was when courage mattered. Walking across the gym, asking someone to dance, hoping they'd say yes. A nod or a smile could make your entire week. Shoes often came off, especially for sock hops, where sliding across the polished floor was half the fun. Dresses twirled, saddle shoes squeaked, and hair-sprayed styles were tested against the humidity of a packed gym. Boys worried about sweaty palms, girls worried about mascara smudging. But once you stepped onto the floor, the nerves turned into rhythm. For some students, the dances were their chance to feel seen. A crush might finally notice you. A shy kid could surprise everyone with a dance move no one expected. Even those who stayed on the sidelines still absorbed the energy, the laughter, and the music vibrating through the room. Adults called these events wholesome, but to the kids living them, they felt huge, like a preview of adult life. Every glance, every song, every moment carried weight. Long after the record stopped spinning and the decorations came down, the memory of a first slow dance, a rejection, or a stolen laugh stuck with you. You're 13. Lockers, Hall passes and hallway life between classes. The hallways of a 1960s school had a life of their own. Rows of tall metal lockers clanged shut in a steady rhythm, creating a soundtrack that echoed against tiled walls. Many of those lockers were dented or scarred with initials scratched in from years before. Inside, students kept their textbooks stacked like bricks, along with mirrors, combs, or maybe a secret pack of gum. Opening your locker wasn't just about grabbing books. It was a quick pit stop to check your look, swap notes, or share a word with a friend before the bell. Getting from one class to another wasn't always simple. Narrow corridors filled quickly, and teachers stood at intersections like traffic cops, urging kids to move along. Hall passes became the golden tickets of the day. These weren't small slips of paper, but often oversized wooden blocks or paddles designed to be too obvious to hide. Carrying one meant freedom from class, though it also made you visible to every adult in the building. The pass told everyone you had permission, and without it, being caught in the hallway could land you in trouble. The hallways were also where social life unfolded in short bursts. A quick chat with friends, a joke whispered at a locker, or a glance at someone you liked. All of it happened between bells. Groups naturally formed, athletes leaning on lockers, bookish kids hugging notebooks close, cheerleaders gathering in clusters. You could learn more about the school's pecking order by walking one hallway at lunch than by sitting through any class. And then, there was the sound. The crackle of the PA system cuts through chatter, announcing schedule changes or morning messages. The shuffle of saddle shoes or polished loafers sliding across the waxed floors. The distant baying of a locker door slamming too hard. It all created an atmosphere that was as much a part of school life as any lesson. For many students, the hallway was the in-between space where they felt most themselves. Away from the eyes of the classroom, but still within the order of school. It was a stage for quick conversations, secret exchanges, and small moments that shaped their days. 14. Typewriters, penmanship, and the battle with ink before laptops and tablets. The written word in school had a very different weight. In the 1960s, assignments weren't typed up in sleek fonts. They were handwritten in careful cursive, or hammered out on a typewriter if you were lucky enough to have access to one. Penmanship was more than neatness. It was treated as a skill that reflected discipline and intelligence. Students practiced loops, slants, and spacing, often on lined paper designed just for handwriting drills. A sloppy page could cost you a grade, even if every answer was correct. For those who did use typewriters, the experience was far from easy. Each key struck with a heavy click, and mistakes couldn't be erased with a backspace. You needed correction fluid or special tape, and even then, the page showed your errors. Carriage returns added to the rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Then a quick swipe of the lever to start a new line. Typing a paper late at night meant the whole house could hear. It was noisy, messy, and sometimes frustrating, but it gave the finished page a weight that digital text can't match. Ink brought its own challenges. Fountain pens leaked if you weren't careful, leaving smudges across your fingers and sometimes across the desk. Ballpoint pens were becoming more common, but teachers still insisted on proper ink for formal work. Students carried blotters, tried to write without dragging their sleeves, and dreaded the moment when one careless smear ruined a page they had spent hours on. These struggles taught patience. You couldn't rush handwriting drills or pound through an essay without thinking ahead. Every mark mattered because you couldn't delete it instantly. For many kids, the pride of handing in a crisp, clean paper after battling with ink stains or typewriter errors felt like its own reward. 15. Science fairs and soda bottle volcanoes. In the 1960s, science fairs weren't just about extra credit. They were a full spectacle. Gymnasiums transformed into rows of folding tables covered in poster boards, hand-drawn charts, and carefully labeled displays. Kids lugged in homemade experiments, some inspired by the space race, others by the classic vinegar and baking soda volcano that never failed to draw a crowd. Projects weren't polished with pre-bought kits like today. They were built in basements, garages, and kitchens, often with the help of a parent who had a knack for tinkering. Space exploration left a huge mark on these fairs. With the race to the moon in full swing, many students focused on rockets, astronomy, or anything that hinted at the future of science. A cardboard model of a spacecraft, a telescope made from pipes, or a demonstration of how gravity worked, all were popular themes. Others leaned into chemistry, lighting up bulbs with potato batteries, or creating simple circuits with bits of wire and tape. Judging was serious business. Teachers and sometimes local officials walked aisle by aisle with clipboards, asking questions to see if students really understood their work. Nerves ran high as kids explained their projects, hoping their explanations sounded smart enough to impress. Winning a ribbon meant bragging rights that lasted the rest of the year, and sometimes your project even got displayed in the hallway for everyone to see. The atmosphere was more than competition, though. It was a chance for kids to show creativity in a way that the normal classroom didn't always allow. Friends wandered the aisles together, pointing out whose experiment fizzled, whose caught fire unexpectedly, and whose actually worked like it was supposed to. Parents filled the gym in the evening to admire the efforts, cameras flashing as they documented cardboard displays and nervous smiles. For many students, the science fair was their first taste of presenting ideas to an audience, learning how to explain, defend, and showcase their work. The projects might have been simple, but the experience was unforgettable. 16. Cold War drills and duck and cover moments. School in the 1960s carried an undercurrent of fear that no playground game or pep rally could erase. The Cold War loomed in the background, and duck and cover drills became as routine as math quizzes. At the sound of a siren or the crackling voice over the PA, classrooms shifted instantly. Students slid under desks, arms covering their heads, or lined up in hallways away from windows. Teachers gave calm instructions, but everyone knew what the drill was meant to prepare for: a nuclear attack. The desks weren't much protection, but the ritual mattered. It created a sense of order in the face of something terrifying. Posters on walls reminded kids about fallout shelters, and pamphlets with survival tips sometimes got sent home. In certain towns, schools even had basements stocked with supplies, marked with the black and yellow fallout shelter symbol. Just seeing that symbol on the wall was enough to remind students of the danger hanging over their lives. For many children, the drills blurred into routine, no different than fire alarms. But others felt the tension deeply. Some remembered holding their breath as the siren wailed, imagining bombs falling from the sky. Even teachers, trying to look calm, couldn't always hide their unease. Conversations at recess sometimes drifted to what-if scenarios, proof that kids understood more than adults wanted to admit. These drills shaped the atmosphere of school life. While recess and dances gave kids freedom, duck and cover moments pulled them back to reality. They showed that the outside world could intrude at any time, no matter how safe the classroom felt. For students who lived through it, the memory of crouching under a wooden desk, the floor cold under their knees, and the silence that followed the alarm is one of the sharpest reminders of growing up in that decade. It wasn't just practice, it was a reflection of the times. Schools prepared kids not only for exams, but also for threats no child should have to think about. The Cold War left its mark on every subject, but nowhere more clearly than in those drills, where fear and discipline mixed into one unforgettable experience. 17. The PA system and morning announcements. Every morning in a 1960s school started with the crackle of the PA system. The sound alone was enough to make a room fall silent. A principal's voice, slightly distorted and sometimes monotone, filled every classroom with announcements about upcoming events, changes in schedule, or reminders about behavior. Before the day really began, students stood with hands over hearts for the Pledge of Allegiance, often followed by the national anthem. That ritual set the tone: formality first, fun later. The PA system wasn't just for routine updates, it carried weight. When a fire drill was called, when the lunch menu was announced, or when a name was summoned to the office, everyone listened closely. Being called over the intercom carried a mix of fear and curiosity. Was it recognition for an achievement or trouble waiting in the principal's office? Either way, the sound of your name echoing across the school was unforgettable. On special days, the system broadcast pep rally reminders, congratulations to sports teams, or holiday greetings. The words often echoed in the background as students shuffled notebooks and sharpened pencils. Teachers sometimes paused their lessons to let an announcement finish, their chalk held mid-air until the voice faded out. Then came the moments when the PA carried news that stopped everyone in their tracks. In November 1963, it wasn't just another message. The voice over the intercom announced the death of President Kennedy, and classrooms across America fell into stunned silence. Students remember the way even teachers struggled to speak afterward. The PA became not just a school tool, but a lifeline to the world beyond the building's brick walls. 18. Gym class showdowns and rope climbs. For many kids in the 1960s, gym class was the part of the day that stirred up the most nerves. The wooden-floored gyms echoed with sneakers squeaking and whistles blowing, and every activity came with its own kind of challenge. Dodgeball, softball, relay races, these were staples, but nothing caused as much dread or pride as the tall climbing ropes dangling from the ceiling. Every student knew the feeling of staring up at that rope, the rough fibers in their hands, and the pressure of classmates watching to see how high they could go. The ropes weren't the only test. Sit-ups, push-ups, and timed sprints often appeared on fitness charts taped to the wall. Teachers demanded effort, shouting encouragement or correction in equal measure. The presidential fitness program, started under President Kennedy, added another layer. Students were measured against national standards, expected to prove strength and endurance through pull-ups, mile runs, and shuttle races. Passing meant a certificate and bragging rights. Falling short could sting. Competition showed up in every corner of the gym class. Teams were chosen, sometimes by captains, sometimes by teachers, and everyone knew the anxiety of waiting to hear their name called. The best athletes carried confidence. Others hoped not to be picked last. But even for those who struggled, small victories counted. Catching a ball, reaching halfway up the rope, or simply pushing through a mile without stopping earned a sense of pride that stuck with you. The gym also doubled as a stage for school spirit. Pep rallies filled the space, dances transformed it, and assemblies turned the bleachers into rows of expectant faces. But during gym class, it was stripped down to the basics: sweat, effort, and the rhythm of games that had no screens, no digital scoreboards, and no excuses. 19. Cafeteria milk cartons and the battle to open them. Every lunch period in a 1960s school came with the same little challenge. That small cardboard carton of milk. It looked innocent enough, but getting it open without spilling was almost a test of skill. Kids pinched the corners, tugged at the folded seams, and sometimes ended up with a splash of milk on their tray before they even took a sip. Some learned tricks, like biting the edge or flattening the top before pulling. But no matter how careful you were, the carton had a way of fighting back. Milk wasn't optional. It was part of the meal, and cafeteria workers made sure every tray carried one. The clink of trays sliding along the counter was often followed by the thud of a carton landing beside Salisbury steak or fish sticks. Cold, slightly waxy, and with a taste that seemed stronger than the milk at home, it became a permanent memory of school lunches. Chocolate milk was rare and usually reserved for special days, making it even more prized when it appeared. The cartons had their own presence beyond the lunch table. Kids used them in games once they were empty, flattening them into makeshift hockey pucks or blowing into the opening to create loud pops that echoed across the cafeteria. Teachers and lunch monitors frowned at the noise, but that only made it more tempting. For some students, the milk carton held comfort, a familiar taste in a room full of noise, gossip, and clattering trays. For others, it was a chore, a lukewarm swallow before heading outside. Yet it united everyone, because no matter where you sat, you had one. The struggle to open it, the trade for chocolate if you were lucky, or the noise of someone squeezing one too hard, it all added to the chaos of the lunchroom. They were tiny symbols of routine, stubborn pieces of cardboard that turned into shared jokes and small frustrations. They made lunch not just about eating, but about problem solving, patience, and sometimes just laughing when the milk sprayed everywhere. 20. Dress codes and skirt length rulers. Walking into school in the 1960s meant following rules that extended far beyond homework and behavior. Dress codes were strict, and principals enforced them with tape measures and rulers. For girls, skirts had to be knee-length or longer, and teachers sometimes made them kneel on the floor to check if the hem touched the ground. If it didn't, they could be sent home to change. Pants were almost always forbidden for girls, no matter how cold the walk to school might be. Boys faced their own restrictions. Hair was expected to be short and neatly combed, often trimmed above the ears. Inspired by the Beatles, some kids began growing their hair longer, only to run straight into school policies banning the style. Shirts had to be tucked in, and t-shirts were rarely allowed outside of the gym. Sneakers were reserved for physical education, leaving polished loafers or saddle shoes as the daily norm. These rules reflected the culture of the time. Schools were seen as places of discipline and order, and appearance was tied directly to respectability. Teachers and administrators believed that neat clothing created neat minds. Students who broke the code weren't just seen as rebellious, they were treated as disrupting the learning environment. Yet the dress codes sparked quiet resistance. Some girls rolled the waistbands to shorten skirts once they were out of sight of adults. Boys let their sideburns grow a little too long, testing how far they could push before being told to get a haircut. Each small act of defiance carried a thrill, a way of carving out individuality inside a system built on conformity. For many who lived through it, the memory of dress codes is more than just fabric and rules. It was the feeling of being measured, literally and figuratively, every time they walked through the doors. It was the clash between tradition and the youth culture, rising outside the school walls. 21. Segregation, integration, and tension in the halls. The 1960s were not only about pep rallies and sock hops. In many parts of America, school hallways were also the front lines of social change. Although the Supreme Court had ruled segregation unconstitutional in 1954, real integration moved slowly. In southern states especially, many schools still operated along racial lines well into the decade. Some black students walked into classrooms where they were the first of their community to attend, facing stares, whispered insults, or even open hostility. Federal laws pushed for change, but resistance was strong. In Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and other states, school boards used loopholes to delay integration. Some schools built freedom of choice systems that looked fair on paper, but in reality, they kept separation alive. By 1964, even after the Civil Rights Act, large numbers of black students still sat in underfunded classrooms with outdated books, while white schools across town had modern labs and bigger budgets. For students, the tension was real. Those entering newly integrated schools often felt the weight of history on their shoulders. Every step down the hallway was a reminder that they weren't just attending classes, they were breaking barriers. Teachers sometimes struggled too, caught between personal beliefs, local politics, and the new laws they were expected to enforce. But alongside the conflict, there were quiet victories. Friendships formed in cafeterias and on playgrounds, where kids shared food, games, and laughter, despite the adults fighting over rules. Sports teams, in particular, forced students to work together, to rely on one another, no matter what the world outside was saying. Integration wasn't smooth, but it planted seeds of change that would grow through the next decades. The laughter of recess, the strict dress codes, the milk cartons, all of it existed alongside the bravery of young people walking into classrooms that didn't want them there. Those students carried more than books. They carried the future of education in America. And while it was often painful, their presence reshaped the hallways forever. 22. Cafeteria trades, Twinkies, and snack currency. The cafeteria in a 1960s school wasn't just about food. It was a marketplace. Every kid knew the unspoken value system that ruled the lunch tables. A Twinkie was top-tier currency, something you could trade for almost anything. Chips, cookies, candy, and even an extra portion of mashed potatoes were all negotiable if you had the right snack. Deals were made in whispers and handshakes, sometimes even before you reached the end of the lunch line. Lunch from home had its own power. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich wrapped in foil, an apple, or a homemade cookie could make you the most popular kid at the table. Those with store-bought snacks often found themselves surrounded by classmates hoping for a bite. Trades weren't just about food. They were about status, alliances, and sometimes friendship. Who saved you a piece of gum? Who tricked you into giving up a prized dessert? These tiny exchanges shaped relationships as much as classroom seating charts did. The noise of the lunchroom made it all feel like a stock exchange. Trays clattered, voices overlapped, and somewhere in the middle of it all, negotiations played out with the seriousness of international treaties. Some kids were natural hustlers, managing to walk away with twice what they started with. Others learned the hard way that a handful of jelly beans didn't really match the value of a brownie. Not every trade ended well, but even the failures taught lessons. You learned quickly about fairness, about reading people, and about timing. A trade offered at the start of lunch had a different value than one offered near the end. When hunger made kids desperate, The cafeteria taught economics in its own way. Supply, demand, and bargaining power all at work over trays of Salisbury steak and cartons of milk. 23. School buses, carpools, and the morning ride. The school day in the 1960s began long before the first bell. For many kids, it started with the bright yellow school bus pulling up to the corner. Those buses weren't air-conditioned, and their seats were stiff, but they carried generations of students across country roads and city streets. The rumble of the engine mixed with the chatter of kids, some still half asleep, others already laughing or passing notes. The back of the bus was its own world, reserved for the boldest students who claimed it as their territory. In suburban neighborhoods, carpools were common. Parents took turns piling kids into station wagons with faux wood paneling, the smell of vinyl seats filling the air. Radios hummed with news or music, sometimes Elvis, the Beatles, depending on the driver. Kids compared homework, swapped gossip, or just stared out the window as the morning rolled past. Walking was still a regular part of life too. Groups of kids trudged to school together, books hugged tight in their arms since backpacks weren't common yet. The ride itself shaped friendships. Sitting next to the same person every day meant you talked, even if you barely knew each other at first. Rivalry started over who got which seat. Teasing and jokes bounced back and forth, while quieter students found corners where they could watch it all unfold. Bus drivers were authority figures, quick with warnings if the noise grew too loud, but often turned a blind eye to the smaller antics. Afternoons carried a different energy. The bus ride home was louder, filled with leftover excitement or the relief of the day being done. Windows cranked open in warm weather, letting in wind that tangled hair and scattered papers. On rainy days, the air grew heavy with the smell of wet clothes and muddy shoes. 24. After-school jobs, clubs, and hanging out. When the last bell rang in the 1960s, the day didn't always end with kids heading straight home. For many, afternoons opened up into a second chapter, one filled with work, hobbies, or just the sweet taste of freedom. Part-time jobs were common, especially for teenagers. Some bagged groceries at the local A&P. Others pumped gas or worked the counter at a diner. The pay wasn't much, but it meant pocket money for milkshakes, movie tickets, or gas for a weekend drive. Having a job also gave a sense of independence, a first real step into adult responsibility. Not every student worked, though. After-school clubs gave kids another world to belong to. There was a debate club, a glee club, a chess club, a Future Farmers of America, and a Future Homemakers of America. Each group carried its own culture. Debate kids sharpened arguments late into the evening, while the glee club filled empty classrooms with harmonies. Sports teams practiced on dusty fields or polished gym floors, and cheerleaders stayed late working on routines for the next pep rally. For others, the hours after school were about gathering with friends. Parking lots turned into social hubs, with kids leaning against cars, flipping through magazines, and talking about music or weekend plans. Some walked down to corner stores to split a soda, while others hung out at each other's houses spinning 45s on record players. These after-school hours mattered because they weren't tightly controlled by teachers or bells. They gave students a chance to try out different roles: worker, performer, teammate, or just friend. Balancing homework with jobs and clubs wasn't easy, but it created rhythms that shaped confidence and character. Even now, people remember the pride of a first paycheck, the nervous excitement of performing at a club event, or the simple joy of walking home with friends, laughing about things that would never make it into the history books. The hours after school were just as formative as the lessons learned inside the classroom. They taught responsibility, gave space for creativity, and built the kind of memories that stretched far beyond the walls of school. 25. Prom, sock hops, and gymnasium dances. Few experiences define the social life of a 1960s student more than school dances. The gymnasium, usually smelling of wax and sneakers, was transformed into a space filled with crepe paper streamers, record players, and nervous excitement. The big event of the year was prom, where boys rented suits or tuxedos and girls wore dresses carefully chosen weeks in advance. Parents took pictures in living rooms before sending their kids off into a night that felt bigger than anything school had ever offered. Sock hops carried a different vibe. They were less formal, often held right after games or on Friday evenings. Shoes were left at the door to protect the gym floor, leaving kids dancing in socks to the latest hits from the Supremes, the Beach Boys, or the Beatles. The music blared through speakers, sometimes from a live band, sometimes from a turntable set up by a teacher. The dances weren't just about moving to music. They were about courage. Asking someone to dance, even in front of classmates, felt monumental. These events brought together every clique: the jocks, the cheerleaders, the shy kids, the brainiacs. They all found themselves under the same colored lights, swaying to slow songs or jumping to fast ones. For some, it was the first chance to hold hands with a crush. For others, it was a night of laughter with friends, posing for photos in awkward corsages and boutonnieres. Teachers chaperoned from the sidelines, keeping an eye out for trouble, but mostly letting students have their moment. Drinks were usually just punch served in plastic cups, with cookies or chips on the side. Yet in the minds of the students, these nights were larger than life. 26. School discipline, detention, and the paddle discipline. In 1960s, schools carried a weight that students today would find hard to imagine. Teachers were strict, and principals carried authority like a badge. Detention wasn't just a place to kill time with homework. It was hours of silence in a room where the clock ticked louder than your own thoughts. Kids sat still, eyes on their desks, reflecting on what they had done wrong while the world outside kept moving. Corporal punishment was still legal, and many schools used it. A wooden paddle, often hanging behind a principal's desk, wasn't just a decoration. It was a promise. Some teachers even kept rulers close at hand, ready to rap knuckles for minor infractions like chewing gum or passing notes. For students, the threat was enough to keep most in line. Stories of classmates being paddled spread quickly, adding to the sense of fear and respect surrounding school authority. Punishment extended beyond physical consequences. Being sent to the principal's office carried its own shame. Everyone knew what it meant when a classmate was marched down the hallway. Parents were usually called, and at home, consequences could be even harsher. The link between school rules and family discipline meant most kids thought twice before pushing boundaries too far. Yet the strictness created a paradox. While it instilled fear, it also gave structure. Students knew exactly where the lines were drawn and what happened when those lines were crossed. That clarity, though tough, offered a sense of order in an era where the world outside felt increasingly chaotic with protests, wars, and cultural shifts. 27. Typewriters, handwriting, and learning without screens. In the 1960s, classrooms didn't hum with the glow of laptops or tablets. Instead, the sound of pencils scratching across lined paper filled the air. Good handwriting wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Teachers drilled students on cursive, filling blackboards with loops and swirls that kids copied again and again until their wrists ached. A neat signature or a legible essay wasn't just about grades. It was seen as a reflection of character and discipline. Typewriters began making their way into schools, usually in business or typing classes. Rows of heavy machines sat on desks, their keys stiff and unforgiving. Students practiced over and over, fingers pounding out letters with the sharp clack of metal striking paper. Mistakes couldn't be erased with a backspace key. You had to start over or carefully fix errors with correction fluid that left messy white smudges. For kids, learning the rhythm of typing was both frustrating and empowering. It was a skill that promised a pathway into office jobs or secretarial work. Paper and ink carried their own challenges. Smudged fountain pens, stained fingers, erasers wore holes through pages, and pages torn from notebooks left ragged edges that teachers frowned upon. There were no shortcuts, no spell check, no copy and paste. Every assignment demanded patience, focus, and care. Yet those limitations gave students a different kind of pride. Handwritten notes carried personality in every curve of a letter. Typed essays felt official in a way a handwritten page could never match. Both required effort, and both left tangible marks of learning. For students, these tools weren't just about assignments. They shaped how knowledge was processed. Writing by hand etched lessons deeper into memory, while the click of typewriter keys introduced them to the pace of the working world. 28. Student protests, war debates, and a changing generation. By the mid to late 1960s, school life was no longer sealed off from the bigger conflicts shaking the country. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the rise of youth culture all began to seep into classrooms. History lessons sparked heated conversations, and civics teachers sometimes faced the difficult choice of staying neutral or acknowledging their own views. For many students, these debates became their first real exposure to politics, morality, and the idea that the government could be questioned. Walkouts and sit-ins, often led by older students, started to appear even in high schools. Some protested the draft, others rallied for equal rights. A quiet tension filled the halls as not everyone agreed. In one classroom, students wore black armbands to symbolize opposition to the war, while across town, assemblies raised money for soldiers. The division was personal, since older brothers or cousins might already be serving overseas. The debates weren't limited to formal protests. They unfolded in cafeterias, on buses, and after school in parking lots. Some kids argued passionately about patriotism and duty, while others spoke of peace, fairness, and the cost of war. Teachers, too, were caught in the middle, with some facing backlash for speaking too boldly about current events. Even those who didn't engage directly felt the ripple. Duck and cover drills reminded kids of nuclear threats, and the assassination of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy hit classrooms hard. Announcements over the intercom sometimes carried news that forced students to grow up faster than they expected. The chalkboard still held math problems, but conversations after class were about war, justice, and what kind of world they would inherit. That generational shift gave students a voice, and even though it unsettled parents and administrators, it showed that schools were no longer just training grounds for workers. They were incubators for citizens. 29. School libraries, card catalogs, and research by hand. Stepping into a school library in the 1960s was like entering another world. The air carried the smell of polished wood and old paper, and silence hung over the rows of bookshelves. Students navigated the space with care, knowing it was one of the few places in school where quiet wasn't just suggested, it was enforced. The heart of the library wasn't the shelves themselves, but the card catalog. Long drawers filled with index cards listed every book by author, title, and subject. Finding a source meant flipping through hundreds of cards, tracing your finger down faded typewritten lines, and writing call numbers on scraps of paper. Research projects demanded patience. Instead of clicking a search bar, students hunted down encyclopedias, thick history volumes, or periodicals stacked in wooden cabinets. Sometimes the book you needed was already checked out, forcing you to wait or improvise. Microfilm machines appeared in some schools, whirring as they scrolled through tiny reels of newspapers and journals. Using one required steady hand and focus, making students feel like detectives piecing together information. The library wasn't just for assignments, though. It was a place to escape noise, sneak a look at a magazine, or flip through a novel when the outside world felt too loud. Librarians were both gatekeepers and guides. They enforced rules about whispering in due dates, but they also pointed kids toward the right shelf when frustration set in. Their stern looks could silence a room faster than a teacher's shout. Working in that setting gave research a physical weight. Every paper required time, movement, and effort. Notes were handwritten, sources carefully copied, and the pile of books on a table was proof of hours spent digging. Mistakes meant starting over, retracing steps through the catalog until the right card turned up. 30. Graduation ceremonies and the end of an era. For students in the 1960s, graduation day felt like crossing a bridge into adulthood. Gymnasiums or football fields were transformed with folding chairs, banners in school colors, and rows of proud families fanning themselves with programs. The air buzzed with a mixture of nerves and excitement as students in stiff gowns and square caps filed in, the sound of pomp and circumstance echoing through the space. The ceremony itself was both simple and deeply symbolic. Principals and teachers gave speeches about hard work, duty, and the bright future ahead. A local official might step up to remind students of their responsibility to the nation during a time when wars and protests filled the headlines. Each diploma handed over represented not just years of schooling, but the beginning of something unknown, whether it was college, military service, or a job in the community. For many families, graduation was the proudest day of their lives. Parents snapped photographs on boxy cameras, capturing sons in ties and daughters with carefully curled hair beneath mortarboards. Younger siblings watched wide-eyed, imagining their own turn years down the road. The weight of expectation hung in the air, but so did the joy of accomplishment. The moments after the ceremony were some of the most memorable. Caps were tossed into the air, hugs exchanged, and tears shed as friends promised to keep in touch. Some gathered at diners or drive-ins to celebrate with milkshakes and French fries, while others headed home to backyard parties where neighbors stopped by to congratulate the graduate. Graduation marked the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. For the class of the 1960s, it was a moment wrapped in pride, hope, and the awareness that life was about to change in ways they could only begin to imagine.